Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM, and in this video we'll be looking at using MeshTools to create this animation. So we've got this really nice rippling of our geometry as it animates on, and then these very stylized growing splines that make their way down. So let's get started. So here we are in a fresh scene. Let's make our base geometry animation first. So we're going to do that using a primitive cube. So let's go to our primitives menu and we'll bring in a cube and leave it default. And let's view the lines in our viewport. So to do that, we can either hit N to bring up the display menu and then hit either D or B for quick shading lines or grad shading lines. Alternatively, you can go to the display menu of our viewport here and pick one of those shadings with lines. So let's just do quick shading lines. And now we can see these black lines. So that'll help us visualize what our mesh tools are actually doing. So first of all, we're going to explore using the MeshTools Subdivider object. So with our cube highlighted, let's hold Alt, and then we'll click on MeshTools Subdivider. And we've just docked our MeshTools here. You can find this menu by going to the INSYDIUM menu, and then we have all of our MeshTools, which you can take off here and then drag and clip to any part of the viewport. So with the cube highlighted, let's hold Alt, hit the subdivider, and it makes it a child, the cube a child of that subdivider. And you can see, if you look in the viewport, we now have subdivided this cube once, which now gives us 4 polys per face. If we switch that subdivider off, that's what the default is set at. The subdivider has done this. Let's increase that subdivision level by 1. So let's stick it up to 2 subdivisions. And now we have, with 2 subdivisions, we have 16 polys per face. So now we have these polys all over our cube, but what we want to do is add a little kind of a random distribution of these subdivisions. So to do that, let's go to our subdivider, we'll go to the shader, and let's bring in a Cinema 4D noise. And we'll go into the thumbnail of that noise and just make a couple of changes. So instead of the default noise, let's pick one with a bit more detail. So we'll go into our noise menu and we'll pick a small detailed noise, FBM. And we want a little bit more contrast here. We don't really want these lots of subtle grays. So if we just come down, we have a contrast slider. If we increase that, you'll see that we get fewer grays and we get more distinction between the blacks and the whites. Let's reduce that global scale down to say 50%. And you can see now we have no subdivisions in our cube. So what we will do, let's just go to our seed, and we're just going to cycle through a few different seeds until we get a bit of kind of randomized subdividing. So this is using the black and white values of the noise, which has been mapped to the object, to decide which polys are subdivided. Because we hardly have any polys, we don't have a lot of very kind of precise control at this point, but we can get a little bit of variation. So with our seed, let's just cycle through, and you'll see with some of these seeds, right, so with this seed, every single one of those polygons is managing to be within one of the white areas of noise, which means that we're getting the 2 layers of subdivisions. Let's just keep cycling through. Okay, so there we go. Look, this one's giving us a little bit of variation. So we'll just leave it at that for now. That'll do. All right, so the next object we're going to observe and have a play around with is the MeshTools Inset. So with the subdivider selected, let's hold Alt and we'll click on the Inset. And let's just have a look at the inset settings. Now, let's just dolly into one of these faces so we can see what's going on here. All right, so with the inset selected, if we increase the amount, you'll see in the viewport that we get an inset poly. So this looks like if we used to Cinema 4D modeling an inner extrude. But because we have the inset mode set to face percentage, it means if we have our percentage on 50%, it means that the larger poly that has been inset has a bigger inset than the smaller poly that's been inset, because it's a percentage of the polygon size. However, if we change this to fixed length, and let's put the fixed length, let's say 20 centimeters, now both of those insets are the same. It doesn't matter how big the original polygon is, they'll all just be the same. And that's actually what we want for this, because what we want to do is separate out these inner faces. So if let's just leave it at this amount of 20. And then if we go to hide outer faces, let's see what happens. Just going to dolly in a bit. So if we hide our outer faces, it's hidden all of those new outer polygons that we created, and we're left with this looking cube. So that's pretty cool. But we don't want these gaps to be this big. So let's reduce this amount down. You see, if we reduce this down, obviously those polys aren't as big. Let's put it down to just 1 centimeter. And now we've developed these small gaps. In fact, we could make that maybe even less. Let's put it at, say, 0.7. Okay. And I'm going to go even lower. Let's go 0.5. So there we go. Right. Now, it'll be clear why we have got rid of those inner faces once we start creating some kind of extruded parts using the shell gen. But we're going to do another layer of subdivisions now. So let's go to our inset, hold Alt, we'll go to another subdivider, and you can see each one of those has now been subdivided. But again, we want to add some randomness to this. So let's just increase the amount of subdivisions in our next subdivider. Let's put it up to, say, 3. And now we're going to bring in a noise to kind of make this look much more random. So let's go to the shader, let's go to noise, let's go into that noise, and again we'll change it from the default noise to an FBM. Let's reduce that global scale down to about maybe 35. So now you can see we're starting to get, again, this kind of randomly subdivided parts of the cube, where some have all levels of subdivision, some have only 2 levels, and some have 0 levels. And let's go and increase the contrast a bit, which has brought out some extra detail. And then let's just cycle through some of these seeds until we get something that's looking pretty nice and random. And we want just a nice bit of variation, really. So we'll just keep having it. Oh, that one looks pretty good. I like that. I like the way this is looking. Now, of course, we can go to the subdivider, to the object tab. We can increase the subdivision levels, so it's going to be even more detailed look. And when you do that, you may feel like you want to cycle through some more seeds until you get a look that you like. But that one's looking good for me so far. Very nice. So now, if we just dolly in, we want to do a similar thing where we want to separate out all of these faces. So the way we did that in the level before was using an inset. So let's use another inset. So we'll highlight our subdivider, hold Alt, let's click on Inset. And this inset, we're going to do the same thing. We don't want to do face percentage. What we want to do is fixed length. Let's put the fixed length really tiny, say 0.1. And if we dolly in, you'll see it's just made this really thin inset on each one. Let's hide the outer faces again, which is going to hide these thin polys. So if we hide that, all right, and dolly out. And now what we have is all of these separated polys. So the reason we have done that is because now that we have all of these separate polys, all of these squares can be treated individually. So now what we're going to do is have them grow outwards. And the tool we're going to use to do that is a MeshTools Shell Gen. So let's highlight our inset, hold Alt, click on Shell Gen. And what we're going to do is, nothing's happened, but that's because by default, the thickness is set to 0 centimeters. So if we increase that thickness, you can see that we're creating this new geometry, it's like it's extruding outwards. By default, we have create cap highlighted, and that means that the other side of this extrude has made a new face. So if we just go inside, you can see that this is the cap on the inside. If we take off create cap, you can see that, look, where it is extruded outwards, we now have this hollow face. If we have create cap, it creates a cap over all of that geometry. We're not going to see the inside of our cube, so we don't need the overhead of extra geometry. So let's just deselect that cap, and we'll just zoom out and come outwards again. They've all been extruded outwards by the same amount though, but here's the beauty. We have a thickness set to 11. Let's add some variation. Let's add a 90% variation to that thickness. And now we're starting to get that look that we're hoping for. So that's looking really interesting. And obviously, if you come away, it obviously adds a kind of a bit like a greeble detail to very, very basic geometry. You can make kind of background objects, high detail, really quickly just by doing a few subdivisions, a few insets, and then using a shell gen to kind of get those to extrude outwards. But you can see now that we're kind of getting the base geometry look for our animation. But what we need to do is we need to animate on the way in which these individual polys are protruding from their base mesh. So that's what we'll do now. And we're going to do that using a field. So if we go to our shell gen, obviously this shell gen is affecting all of our base geometry equally. But if we go to the fall off and we let's bring in a spherical field. Now, only where the spherical field is positioned will we get that shell gen doing its thing. And there you can see that where the field is at 100%, we're getting all of that. Let's have a look. How far was it? All of that 11 centimeters of extrusion. And then as that field falls off, we go down to 0. So we've got a bit more kind of snappy performance in the viewport. Let's set this animation up with fewer subdivisions. This is one of the beauties of MeshTools and the way in which it's a procedural modeling tool, is that we can go to lower subdivisions, lower poly, to set up the animations, and then just ramp it back up to full detail when it comes to render time. So let's go to our second subdivider, and let's go to the object tab, and look, let's just reduce the subdivision level by 2. And now we've got loads less to deal with here, far fewer polys, and we're going to get really snappy viewport performance. So if we grab our spherical field and move that, you can see that, look, where there are no polys within inside that field, we're not getting any effects of that shell gen. And as we bring it down, you can see that they come in. So the way in which we're going to get this almost kind of rippling effect of these polys coming out is we're going to start with our sphere. Let's hit F5 to go to the orthographic view, and we'll go to the front view. Let's click on here, and we'll move this sphere so its center axis is lined up with the top of the cube. Okay, cool. Let's hit F1 to go back to perspective view. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to our spherical field, and we're going to go to the field tab, and let's set the size to 0 so it has no size. So because it has no size, we have no effect of our shell gen. And what we'll do, let's go to say frame 10 and hit a keyframe on the size of that field. Then let's go to say frame 70. And we'll increase that size, and it's going to want to encapsulate the entire cube. So let's just keep growing that until everything is in there, something like that, and hit another keyframe. So now what we get is this growing on of our field, which makes our subdivisions kind of pop out. Now we can get this to look a little bit more. Let's make that field invisible. We can get this to make this look like a little bit more like a kind of a shockwave growth by adjusting the field and the way that it falls off. So to do that, let's go to our spherical field. We're going to go to the Remapping tab. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the contour. So let's go to contour mode and we're going to pick curve, which gives us, let's click this, it gives us a user adjustable curve. And this dictates the ramping up and down, the fall off from 0 to 100 of our field. And what we want to do is we want this to dip a little in the middle and then dip back up again, which will give us a wave. So how do we do that? Well, it's really simple. If you can see, this curve, this default curve here, is what is defined by this curve here. So if I grab this knot, pull it over, you can see, look, it's changed the curve. So all we need to do is, let's put them both to 0. I'm going to hold Control. Let's click to add another knot. And we're going to bring this one all the way up to the top. And now let's bring this one up a little bit because we still want some effect. Maybe something like that. Okay, so now if we play it, it's going to extrude the most when it gets to this point, and then it's going to fall off a little. And if we hit play, you should see that we get a bit of a bulge, yeah, and we're getting a much more of a ripple look. That's looking pretty neat. Let's make that field invisible and have a look at that animation. So we can really see that coming into effect, and it makes it feel like it's kind of like a wave of energy that's passing over the object. Now, because we have keyframed, let's go to the field tab, we've keyframed this size, and actually this isn't a linear animation from keyframe to keyframe. By default, the Cinema 4D is set up to do a Bezier curve, which means that this sizing up of our field, it starts to resize more slowly, then it gets faster and faster, and then it gets slower as it gets to the next keyframe, and we can adjust that. So let's just right click on this which we've keyframed. So right click on the size. Let's go to animation. Let's go to view F curve. And this opens up our timeline dope sheet. And here is our last keyframe. Here's our first keyframe. And look, we have this Bezier curve of going from 0 to the end size. And we want it to start, we don't want it to start off changing slowly and then ramping up. We want it to change quite quickly at first. So as you can see at the moment, both points are selected, which means if we move one handle, the other handle moves as well. Let's just hit undo. So let's click on here, which deselects the points. Let's click just this one. And if we move this up, it means that that animation is going to ramp up much more quickly, and we're not going to get a bit of a lag at the beginning. So let's shut that timeline down and let's hit play. Yeah, that's much more what I want. It's arguably maybe a little bit too quick. So we go back to our spherical field. Let's put a few more frames in our timeline. We've only got 90 at the moment, 3 seconds. Let's put that up to say 250. And then here is our keyframe here. So we can grab it and let's just pull it along, which will slow down that animation a little bit. Let's hit play. Very cool. And if we go to our shell gen and we increase the thickness now to say 20, we're going to get a bigger bulge. And that's looking pretty cool. So I would say that's actually too big. Let's put it down to say 12. And if we want to have a look at what it might look at the kind of the higher model resolution, we can go back to our second subdivider, which we toned down a bit. Let's go back to that and let's increase it by say just 1 for now. So this is loads more polys. Let's just put a Cinema 4D light in this scene. So we can get something that looks like that. Okay, and then hit play. So it's a bit slower now because we've introduced a massive amount of polys compared to before. But there you can see we're getting that basic animation happening from being a flat cube to then animating on. Now we can see all of this shadowing because remember we made gaps in this geometry. That's what we used our insets for, which separated this all out. And we can see those gaps now that we've added a light, because obviously the light's shining through and there's shadows being cast and whatnot. So what we need to do is we need to hide these. And the way we do that, let's just rename this before we introduce any more geometry. The way we do it is we're going to add another cube. But before we do, let's just select this original cube and let's just call this base geo cube, and then let's get another Cinema 4D cube. And so now we just have two exactly the same sized and shaped cubes on top of each other, and so obviously we're filling in those lines, and then when we hit play and we get our animation on, we get this effect, which looks really cool. Okay, so just before we move on to the next element, there's actually, we can make this geometry look even more interesting by another feature that is found in the shell gen object. So if we click on this object, let's just dolly in a bit. We can even press ND to show those lines again. So what we're able to do with our shell gen, if we go to the object tab, we can create a bevel for every edge of these extruded polys. So obviously this is going to add loads more geometry, so you have to be careful when adding this because you're introducing so many more calculations to your scene. But let's just demonstrate this. If we click on bevel edges, at first nothing has happened, but that's because we have no offset whatsoever. So let's create a 0.5 centimeter offset. And you'll see if we go in, look, we've created this bevel on every single one of those faces. And we've got the usual bevel tools that you would imagine. So we can increase the subdivisions of just the bevel. So let's increase that. And then we've subdivided it. Let's do, say, 2. And then we're able to change the kind of shape of that subdivision. So if we change the depth, you can see if we go up percentage, we're making a convex bevel. And if we go down in that depth, we're making a concave bevel. And the more subdivisions you have, obviously, the more smooth that becomes. Let's put that back down to default. Or you can change the shape of that bevel, and there's the usual bevel tools. So you can choose round, you can create a profile using a spline, you can use a user-defined shape, which uses this user shape here. So there's loads of adjustability to get your bevels as you wish. But the one thing to remember is if you have a heavily subdivided piece of geometry with thousands, hundreds of thousands of polygons, adding bevels obviously is going to have a CPU overhead because you're introducing so much more geometry, and you may choose, depending on what render engine you're using, to add the bevel at render time. Cycles 4D, for example, can add bevels at render time, which is a really quick and light way of doing it. Let's just switch off those bevels for now. And let's just put our subdivider up to the full subdivisions, which was 5, which is going to insert a massive amount of geometry. But then look at this detail. If we hit NA to hide those lines, and we've got all of this really cool detail now in this animated cube. So that bit is relatively simple to set up, and that is the base part of this animation. What makes this really cool is those animated splines. So we're going to look at that now. So with that in mind, let's just, first of all, let's rename this shell gen object. Let's call this shell gen, and we'll call it geoanim. So we know that that's going to be our geometry animation. And then for now, let's just hold Control Alt, and we will disable all of that. And let's just deactivate this cube as well. Okay, so the tool that we're going to use to create our nice animated splines is the MeshTools Shortest Path. So let's just bring one of those into our scene. And to demonstrate exactly what this is doing, let's just use a bit of geometry which we won't use in our final scene, but it'll just illustrate what's happening here. So let's just bring in a plane object. And if we hit ND to see the lines, here we can see our polygons. So if we make our plane a child of our shortest path object and go to our shortest path, let's go to the object tab. And what we have is a starting number of 1, which has its own seed. And we have an end number of 1, which has its own seed. And at the moment, we can't see anything. Nothing seems to have changed. But if we hide these lines, let's hit NA, you can see that, look, we have this green spline. So what's happening? Well, let's go back to our shortest path. Let's go to the display tab and let's hit show start and end points. So we'll click those on and then we'll just increase the size of those. And then you can see now in our viewport, we have a start point, which is blue, and an end point, which is red. So what's happening is, let's go back to the shortest path object tab. We have selected this to have one start point, which is the blue, and then it's randomly picked one end point, which is the red. And then the spline is drawn, the shortest path between those 2 points, following, if we hit ND, following the edges of our geometry. So if we say, look, instead of there only being one end point, let's put this up to say 50, and now we've got all 50 of these points, and they're all coming from this one start point, and they're finding their way via the shortest path along the edges of the geometry. So then if we go down to the spline growth section and we animate the end down to 0, you'll see we've got no spline, and as we animate it on, they're finding their way to those end points. If we change the seed of those end numbers, they'll just be distributed in a different variation, and then they'll be recalculated and we'll get different splines. So that is how it works. We also have a custom growth rate option. So if we click this on, you'll see all those splines have disappeared. Now if we hit play and then they grow on, and we can also add some variation to that, so you'll see them grow on at different rates. So that's looking very neat indeed. So that's the basics of how the shortest path object works. And because, if we hit ND to see the lines, because it uses the geometry, the edges of the object, if we create an object with very intricate, interesting topology, we're going to get some very interesting shortest path splines. So let's just get rid of that shortest path in the plane, because we were just doing that to illustrate. What we are going to do is we're going to create a cube, which we're going to use in our shortest path to get these interesting splines. So let's bring in a scene cube and let's give it some base segments. Let's say 4 by 4 by 4. And now what we want to do is we want this to be, well, we want to add some polygons, and we can use that using the various different MeshTools objects. So let's get our cube, hold Alt, and we'll first put it in a subdivider. Let's subdivide it by, say, 2. But let's give these, make these subdivisions more random. So we'll do that again using a shader. So let's go to Noise. We'll go into our Noise shader, and let's change it from Noise to, we could try a Blistered Turbulence. Let's reduce the scale of that down to, say, 40, and we'll increase the contrast way up. So now we're kind of getting that subdivided cube is more random. What we could do is cycle through a few different seeds until we get something we like the look of. Okay, so we've got all these larger points at the top. That's perhaps not going to be right for us. So we can still, there we go. That looks pretty interesting. Okay, so let's leave that at that. Now what we're going to do, remember, we are wanting a spline to grow which follows these paths. And at the moment, because all our polys are square, we're going to get very obvious kind of 90-degree angles in our spline. So if we were to triangulate this rather than it being square polys, we're going to get some more interesting looking splines growing out. So let's get our MeshTools subdivider, hold Alt, and we're going to put it inside a dual graph. That has triangulated our mesh. And now let's add a further level of subdivisions for even more interest. So we'll hold our dual graph, hold Alt, and we'll click on subdivider. Let's give it, say, one more subdivision layer, so really quite intricate. But then we can make this more random by giving this a noise shader as well. So let's go to the shader menu, noise, and let's pick a, well, let's just use the same, use a blistered turbulence. We'll put that global scale down to, say, 30, put the contrast up. And now we're getting a really kind of broken up. I mean, look at this topology. And if you imagine, this is giving us far more likely to have some kind of interesting wiggly splines because the way in which that we've sorted out these triangulated polygons on our mesh. So let's go to our subdivider, to the object tab, maybe add one more level of subdivision so it's really fine in places. And then look, we can play around with the tolerance here, which will change the way in which that noise has an effect on our mesh. So by decreasing that tolerance, more and more parts of this are becoming subdivided. So something like that is looking pretty interesting. Okay, so what we'll do from now is we're actually going to, we could continue with this in a procedural nature, but what we're going to do is actually make this editable, which is going to make it easier for us to kind of direct exactly where these splines are coming from. So because we're making it editable, what's a good idea is to save this procedural hierarchy in case we want to go back to it. So let's just hold Alt and put it inside a null, and let's call the null, we'll rename it and call it Shortest Path Geo. All right, let's hold Control Alt to switch all that off so it's not wasting processor power, and we can just make all that invisible as well. Okay, so now what we want to do is use these objects to create its own polygon object. So to do that, we do need to have it enabled, obviously. Let's go to the top subdivider, right click, and we're going to go current state to object. Let's click on that. So that keeps our hierarchy. It hasn't changed it in the slightest. So let's just switch all that off now and close that down. And what's that? What that has created, let's drag out this null. And inside there is our single object, which is a copy. So if we bring that down, here we have, and we can delete this null that was created. We don't need that. So here we have our cube, which is a polygon object now. It's no longer editable, but we have this really interesting topology. So now when we start using this object as the object for our shortest path, we've got the option to have lots of varied random lines being drawn. So let's do that. Let's take this cube, hold Alt, and we'll click on the shortest path so it becomes a child. And we're not seeing anything at the moment because we're seeing the Cinema 4D black lines. Now, if you follow my mouse down to the bottom left, you can see that we are rebuilding paths. So it's creating those automatic paths based on this geometry. And obviously, the more detailed your geometry, the more polygons that you have, the longer it's going to take to process these calculations and build those paths. So that's been built. Now, if we hit NA, you can see again, we have one path. And that, again, if we go to our shortest path, go to the object, we have one starting number and one end number. And if we go to display, show those points, make them a bit bigger. Here's our start point. It's just a random point on the cube. And here's our end point. But we want all of our animated splines to start right from the middle of this top face. So how do we do that? Well, let's just switch off the shortest path. And in our cube, we're going to go to point mode. And let's dolly right in. And we're going to make a selection, a point selection, right in the middle of that face, that one. And let's go to select, store selection. And that creates a selection tag on our cube. All right, let's go back to object view. So now in the shortest path, we can go to the object tab, and instead of the starting source just being a random point, we can drag in that point selection. Let's reactivate our shortest path. It's going to rebuild that path because it's changed and now it's going to be starting from a different place. So it's rebuilding that path and calculating all of those different edges to calculate its shortest path from the start to the end point. And there we have it. So now let's increase the amount of end points. At the moment we only have one. Let's put this up to say 500. And this is going to take, again, it needs to rebuild all of these paths. And now it's creating 500 end points. So it's having to calculate an awful lot of polygons and edges to find that shortest path. But here we go, just finishing. And now we have something that's looking pretty interesting. Okay. Now, one thing to note is that if we look underneath, we're going to be viewing this from up here. And if let's just go to that shortest path and switch off the display. And we've got our splines and they're going to be kind of firing down the side of our cube. And this is fine. This is going to work okay for us. Let's go to the object tab with the shortest path. And we can see that animating on like this, like whizzing down. But we've got a lot of end points which are underneath, which we don't really need. All of these endpoints we don't really need. So what we could do is, we could just leave it and it'll work as such, or we could delete these bottom face polygons. But for us, this is actually going to work fine. This is looking good. So let's look at animating this. If we switch custom growth rate on, hit play, you're going to see them growing on. And we could actually give them some growth variation so they go at different rates. And this is looking cool. They're working their way down. And when they have kind of little intricate parts, they can use it. Where not, they don't. And this is looking really nice. Okay. So now we have this set up. What we need to do is see how are we going to incorporate this in the rest of our scene. Now remember, the cube that we use to create our shortest path has the same, if we come down to the size information here, the same dimensions as our base cube, our shell gen geo anim cube. Actually, we want this to be a bit bigger because we want these trails to be kind of outside, offset from the surface of our shell gen geometry, which is kind of offset, so it's bigger than this default. So we can view what we need to do by reactivating that original geometry animation. So let's hit Control Alt and reactivate all of that. Now we're not really seeing anything at the moment. Here we go. Right, so you can see now that our splines are within the offset of our shell gen, so we're not seeing them. So all we're going to do to fix that is just scale up this cube. So let's just switch off the shortest path. With the cube selected, let's hit T, and we'll just scale this up so it's just outside of those shell gen offset polygons. So then we can make this cube invisible, Let's reactivate the shortest path. It's going to rebuild those paths for us because obviously we've altered the base geometry. So if we follow my mouse down to the bottom left, it's rebuilding that path information. But then once this is done, we're going to have those paths animating on top of this geometry. And there you go. There we're getting that look. All right, so that's looking pretty nice. We've got our shortest path simulation done. We've also got our geometry simulation done. So now what we need to do is kind of line up these various bits of animation so it all feels like, kind of a coherent piece. So what we're going to do, first of all, let's just deactivate our shortest path for now. We're going to ignore that one for now. And if we return back to our shell gen geo anim, which is our main animation going on, this kind of wave of these subdivided areas moving across this cube. Now, because this is an incredibly complex piece of geometry, this actually takes quite a long time to play in our viewport, and it's because it's so heavy. There are so many polygons in this scene. So what we're going to do, so we can kind of work out the timing of our spline animations a bit more easily, we're going to bake this geometry down. So to do that, let's go and we'll just make a little bit more room in our object manager. All we're going to do is directly bake this top level, and we can bake it to Alembic really quickly and easily. Let's find out exactly where our animation ends, though. We'll go to our spherical field, which is animated, and look, it's ending here at around frame 95. So what we'll do, let's just reduce our timeline to 95 frames. Excellent. We'll go to our top object and make sure it's highlighted. Right click, and then let's bake as Alembic. Now this is going to take a wee while to bake because we've got so many polygons going on in this object. There's an awful lot of information that it is working out and then baking to disk. So we'll pause it here. I'll come back to you when it's finished, tell you how long it took, and then we can have a look at that animation in real time and then start timing our spline animations too. Okay, so that took 4.5 minutes to cache to Alembic, and let's have a look at what we've got. So in our scene, everything looks the same, but now we suddenly have this null object, which has the same name as our parent geometry. So let's just shut down our MeshTools live procedural rig. We'll just hold Control and Alt, click on that, so that's no longer working. And now we can have a look in this. This is our Alembic, and we have the null and then the actual Alembic below that. So let's just drag out that, and we'll delete the null. We don't need the null. So here is our Alembic. So if we now hit play, well, we can just scrub through. And now we're getting really nice feedback, and we can play our animation, and there's our kind of like shock wave as our polys are all extruding. That looks pretty cool. We haven't actually got any shadows in this scene. Let's go to our light, let's go to shadows, and let's do some soft shadows. Let's go to options and select shadows so we can see them, and then let's just move this light around a little bit. There you go. So it's just looking a little bit more dramatic. And then those lights, let's go into the lights, let's go to the shadows. We'll just reduce the density down to say 85%, just so we can see what's going on here. And now when we hit play, very nice animation. So we can make active our, do you remember this was our kind of dummy cube, which was in there to hide the gaps that we'd created. So now when we hit play, we get that rippling from nowhere, and that looks really good. Very pleased with that. Okay, so now we have that playing in real time. Now we can have a look at our shortest path splines and try and work out when we want these to animate on. So let's activate our shortest path, and it's just rebuilding those paths once more. So what we could do at this point, actually, we could set this to have fewer end number points, just so it's not processing as many shortest paths. Let's have a look. and we have this on custom growth, so it's going to grow from nothing, but obviously these are going to grow on too quickly. What we really want is for the ripple to happen first and then the splines to start growing. So let's just have a look at where we want that to happen. So we don't want any splines yet, and we want them to kind of start coming out at this point. So let's do this. At the frame where we want it to start, we will bring our end growth down to 0 and we'll hit a keyframe. And then let's go forward a few more frames. And then we want it to be completing shortly after this is completed. So a little bit longer maybe there, and we'll go to 100%. All right, hit a keyframe. Let's try that again, see how it's looking. And then here come our splines. So they need to be a little bit quicker. So what we can do, they're coming on at the right time, but they're a little bit slow. So we can do a couple of things. We can bring this keyframe in. This is our end animation point. So they come on a little bit more quickly. Let's have a look. Perhaps even quicker. Okay, so here comes the ripple, here comes the splines. That's looking pretty cool. And we could also go to our shortest path and we can increase our growth rate. So they're going to grow on a little bit more quickly. Let's try that. And here comes our splines, working their way down. And that's very cool. And again, arguably, I could say these could grow on even more quickly. So let's go back to our shortest path. We'll animate them on even more quickly. Let's have a look. We don't want them beating the ripple, but we certainly want them kind of in the ballpark. So let's try that. Nice. And then arguably, let's go to shortest path. Let's increase that growth rate even more. And obviously you do this and you time it how you want it. But for us, it's looking pretty good. And now we're getting our paths making their way down. Very nice. So what we can do at this point, that's looking good. What we could do, if we wanted to, before we did a test render, we could actually bake these paths down to alembic splines as well. So we could play through those and get an idea of the real-time feedback. So let's have a go at setting that up now. So all we're going to have to do is go to our shortest path. Everything's already set up. So let's right click on our shortest path and we'll set to bake as alembic. And what you'll see is it's going to have to, if you follow my mouse down to the bottom left, it's going to have to build those paths once at the beginning, and then it'll just start baking every frame pretty quickly. So as soon as those paths have been built, we'll see our exporting alembic, and look, you can see it chugging through that really quick. So let's just stay with it. It's only going to be a few more seconds. That'll be finished, and then we'll be able to hide and deactivate our live shortest path, and then we'll be able just to scrub through this alembic pretty quickly. So just coming to an end now. There it goes. Okay. And once it comes through, what we can do is switch off our procedural shortest path, and it's going to have our spline ready for us. So let's switch that off, make it invisible. And now we have our shortest path spline here. This is the alembic. And if we scrub through that, you can see that we've got our splines coming on. There we go. So then if we hit play, and our splines are coming on. Now, obviously, because we baked this, the splines come in as a black color. Let's go to the basic. We'll put our display on, and we can make them white, or we can make them whatever color we want. So I don't know. Let's just give them a little bit of a glow color, and hit play. So there we've got our animation, and then on come our animated splines. Now, of course, we're just seeing this in the viewport. So let's just make this look a little bit more interesting at this stage. So we'll put in a scene camera and we'll go to the camera, to the object tab. Let's pick a focus distance and let's focus on this area of our cube. And we'll then go to the options tab. Let's activate depth of field. We'll go to the physical tab of our camera and let's put a smaller aperture number in here. So 1 maybe. We could even go 0.5. Hit play. And now you're seeing we're getting this cool animation. Let's put that aperture down way low so we've got some real blurred out splines. And there you can see pretty quickly we've got this very intricate looking animation, which is actually made from just 2 simple scene cubes, and we've created this shortest path animation of our splines. Now arguably you could say that now it's running at full speed, it's perhaps running a little bit too quickly, but of course you could make changes to your base animations by reactivating the shortest path and the shell gen object, or you can just go into your alembic and obviously you can adjust the speed at which that plays, and you can make those animation adjustments there.